Hello Whisky fans. So there's something I want to talk about today, and that is floaters, sediment, and to a lesser extent haze. Basically anomalies, things that you sometimes find in whiskey which some people might say shouldn't be there. And the TLDR on this, or the too long didn't watch, is basically generally whenever you see these things in a whiskey, it's generally not really anything to worry about. So there are several ways where you can get sediment or floaters in whiskey. One of them is minerals that are actually leached into the whiskey from the cask during maturation, and this is especially true with sherry cask matured whiskies, especially older whiskies. You can actually get a lot of minerals into the whiskey where there's so much sediment that it can actually settle in a layer in the bottom of the bottle. It's not to say that it's not something that can happen with bourbon matured whiskies as well. It's just something that is more well known with the sherry cask maturation. There have actually been times when very rare and old bottles of sherry matured whiskey have come to auction, and they've actually looked for sediment settling at the bottom of the bottle as evidence that it's not fake. So in those cases, the people looking to sell and buy this incredibly rare whiskey for a large sum of money, they're not worried at all that it's had any effect on the whiskey. They're actually looking for it as a positive thing, as proof of authenticity. There are some other ways when you can get things in the bottle. Actually, lipids and fats and esters, certain natural compounds that should be in all quality whiskey, under certain conditions, especially in a cold environment, sometimes during transport or storage at home, some of those compounds can separate out of the whiskey, especially over many years, and they can either settle towards the bottom, or sometimes you see them suspended in the whiskey itself, floaters floating in the whiskey. And again, absolutely nothing to worry about. It's actually, again, a sign of quality more than anything else, because it shows that whiskey has not been heavily filtered. It shows that the good stuff in the whiskey has been left intact, as opposed to some whiskies, and most of you are probably aware of the term chill filtration and non-chill filtered, or unchill filtered. Chill filtration tends to be regarded as the extreme of the filtration spectrum when it comes to whiskey. It's a process where you cool the whiskey to a very low temperature, so the oils and fats that can cause haziness and sometimes sediment in whiskey, especially at low temperatures, or if you add ice, or if they're bottling at very low ABV, such as 40%, or generally below 46%, can cause some haziness with a lot of whiskies if they're not extremely heavily filtered. So once you have your whiskey cooled down to the required temperature, you then force the whiskey through a series of filters, and because you've caused all of those organic compounds to become more viscous, a higher percentage of them are trapped in those filters, and you end up with a very clear whiskey, what some whiskey distillers regard as an aesthetically appealing whiskey. That's a matter of dispute. The whole reason behind this is that a lot of distillers, they believe that if a customer goes into a shop and they see a bottle of whiskey which has haziness in it, they might perceive that as low quality, where actually the complete opposite is true. If you can see haziness in a whiskey, especially at low temperatures, it's quite often a sign that it's a quality sort of craft produced product. Another way that you can get sediment into a whiskey is actual particles from the barrel. So barrel char, and even in extremely unfiltered whiskies, sawdust from the barrel itself. So that's reasonably rare, because even distilleries that don't practice pure filtering, they will tend to at least barrier filter to get those heavier particles out. But I have seen, especially in some bourbons it seems, you can sometimes see almost sawdust either in suspension or settled in the bottom of the bottle. And I don't have proof of this, but I suspect that with Scotch whisky, the dreaded E150A may be another culprit here. E150A, otherwise known as spirit caramel, is the only thing that's allowed to be directly added to a Scotch whisky, and it's used as a colouring. And it's a controversial practice, and it seems to slowly be becoming less and less normal. But I know for a fact that whiskies which are heavily coloured, I have noticed that in the glass the next day you can quite often see sort of a high tide line and maybe a little bit of sediment where the caramel that's been in the whiskey that's stuck to the sides of the glass or settled in the bottom can actually solidify into a little blob of caramel in the glass the next day. And again, the addition of spirit caramel is purely on cosmetic grounds. Some people argue that it has no effect on the whiskey, doesn't affect the flavour or aroma of the whiskey, and I would probably be making a video on that at some point, because that is also another controversial practice. So one last source of sediment and floaters in whiskey that has to be mentioned, and it's just brought me back to that thinking about Bruichladdich actually, is the actual water that the distillers use to dilute the whiskey down to the proof that they want at the bottling stage. Obviously with cask strength whiskey there's no added water at that stage, so that's not an issue, but the majority of whiskies, they are diluting them to a target ABV that they think that the customer expects. And what you'll find is a lot of the craft distillers, they will actually use spring water, quite often spring water from a spring on site that they own, to add a little bit of extra quality. It's tap water, doesn't matter where you live, it's not quite up to the standard of good old spring water in terms of freshness and producing a natural product. But what you can get in spring water is you can get quite a lot of minerals in the spring water, which is again not a bad thing, and some of those minerals can again separate out in the bottle, especially over time or in cold conditions, and that's another way that you can get sediment in the bottle. And I've actually talked to Bruichladdich about this, and I've had a couple of bottles of Bruichladdich that have had reasonably heavy sediment in the bottle, and they've confirmed this, that it is calcium oxalate that's separated out of the natural spring water that they're using. So again, in no way a bad thing. So I will put some photos on screen at some point, so you can see some examples of the things that I'm talking about. One thing that you can do at home is have a look at your bottles, because you don't have to wait until it's got to the stage where you have a heavy build-up of sediment in the bottle. What you can actually do, and I'm recommending doing this with caution because it can make you a little bit over-paranoid. You can get a bottle of your favourite Scotch, and as I mentioned before, anything that's been heavily chill filtered, you might not see anything, especially if it's been bottled recently. But even this Dahlewin that I've got here, which again is a wonderful whiskey that I will be reviewing on this channel at some point, what you need to do is if you look closely, I cannot see anything at all in that. It looks perfectly clear, and I'm not sure, but I do believe that Dahlewin probably do chill filter their whiskey, which is a shame. But what you can do, if you get any household torch or the light on your phone, if that's what you've got to hand, and you shine it up through the bottom of the bottle, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see anything or not here because it's on camera, but you will definitely see in some whiskies some sediment appearing as light dust, sometimes swirling around, light haziness in the bottle. And it has to be said, I can actually see some in this bottle of Dalyuan, even though it is ever so clear, and I believe it is chill filtered. And if you tip the whiskey and then shine through the bottom there, you will see a lot of bubbles. But hopefully, I can see it myself here, but hopefully you too at home can see that there is a little bit of swirling sediment in there. And this bottle's not that old. It's a reasonably recent purchase. So it just goes to show that even with a chill filtered whiskey, a little bit of haze, even sediment, is not only nothing to worry about, it's incredibly common. It's normal. The one thing that I will say is a bit of a red flag with whiskey. If there is a lot of sediment in the bottle and you examine the cork, and the cork is significantly dried out, has maybe holes in it, you can see dark patches where it started to go a little bit rotten, then that sediment could actually be the decomposing cork, especially if a whiskey is stored long term on its side with the cork soaking wet. Whiskey corks are not designed to be immersed in whiskey. You would think they would be, but they're not. It's not the same as wine. And in that situation, the cork can actually break down relatively quickly. And what I'm not talking about here is cork taint, which is something that a lot of people talk about in wine, and it is something that can apply to whiskey. But if you have a cork which has started to get a bit crumbly and you have pieces in the whiskey, that is not necessarily going to give you any off flavours or cork taint, as people call it, in the whiskey. But what you do have to be careful of is that the cork doesn't completely dissolve and fail to form a seal. I'll probably cover that in another video at some point as well. So again, whiskey fans, TLDR, TLDW, if you see haziness or even sediment in your whiskey, don't worry. Look at it as a good thing. It's a badge of honour. If it tastes good, it is good. Cheers.
Ooh.